All right. I listened back to my first few sessions. I'm not sure if I'll actually recut and re-edit and repost those up to YouTube as lives or as videos. I wasn't deeply impressed with the blind read as far as how it feels like it goes after I've read it a couple of times. I may change my mind. We'll see. Who knows? But I've been enjoying the story so far, so I'll keep on going for a bit. Hopefully 3 more chapters tonight. We'll see. Chapter 7. A very few days more, and Captain Wentworth was known to be at Kellyanch. Oh shoot, 1 second, I forgot to start recording on Audacity. Give me 1 moment. Okay. There we go. All right. Chapter 7. A very few days more, and Captain Wentworth was known to be at Kellyanch, and Mr. Musgrove had called on him and come back warm in his praise, and he was engaged with the Crofts to dine at Uppercross by the end of the week. By the end of another week. And it had been a great disappointment to Mr. Musgrove to find that no earlier day could be fixed, so impatient was he to show his gratitude by seeing Captain Wentworth under his own roof, and welcoming him to all that was strongest and best in his cellars. But a week must pass, only a week in Anne's reckoning, and then she supposed they must meet, and soon she began to wish that she could feel secure even for a week. Captain Wentworth made a very early return to Mr. Musgrove's civility, and she was all but calling there in the same half hour. She and Mary were actually setting forward for the great house, where, as she afterward learnt, they must they must have inevitably have found him. They must inevitably have found him when they were stopped by the eldest boys being at that moment brought home in consequence of a bad fall. The child's situation put the visit entirely aside, but she could not hear of her escape with indifference, even in the midst of the serious anxiety which they afterwards felt on his account. I'll find what I like eventually. Maybe there. His collarbone was found to be dislocated, and such injury received in the back as roused the most alarming ideas. It was an afternoon of distress, and Anne had everything to do at once: the apothecary to send for, the father to have pursued and informed, the mother to support and keep from hysterics, the servants to control, the youngest child to banish, and the poor suffering one to attend and soothe, besides sending, as soon as she recollected it, proper notice to the other house, which brought her an accession rather affrighted inquiring companions than a very useful assistance. Her brother's return was the first comfort. He could take best care of his wife. The second blessing was the arrival of the apothecary. Till he came and had examined the child, their apprehensions were the worse for being vague. They suspected great injury, but knew not where. But now the collarbone was soon replaced, and though Mr. Robinson felt, and rubbed, and looked grave, but now the collarbone was soon replaced, and though Mr. Robinson felt, and rubbed, and looked grave, and spoke low words both to the father and the aunt, still they were all to hope the best, and to be able to part and and to be able to part and eat their dinner in tolerable ease of mind. And then it was just before they parted that the two young aunts were able so far to digress from their nephew's state as to give the information of Captain Wentworth's visit, staying 5 minutes behind their father and mother to endeavor to express how perfectly delighted they were with him, how much handsomer, how infinitely more agreeable they thought of him than any individual among their male acquaintance who had been at all a favorite before. How glad they had been to hear Papa invite him to stay to dinner, how sorry when he said it was quite out of his power, and how glad again when he had promised to reply to Papa and Mamma's farther invita- when he had promised to reply to Papa's and Mamma's farther pressing invitations to come to dine with them on the morrow, actually on the morrow, and he had promised it in so pleasant a manner as if he felt all the motive of their attention just as he ought. And, in short, he had looked and said everything with such exquisite grace that they could assure them all their heads were both turned by him. And off they ran, quite as full of glee as of love, and apparently more full of Captain Wentworth than of little Charles. The same story and the same raptures were repeated when the two girls came with their father through the gloom of the evening to make inquiries, and Mr. Musgrove, no longer under the first uneasiness about his hair, could add his confirmation and praise, and hoped there would be now no occasion for putting Captain Wentworth off, and only be sorry to think that the cottage party, probably, would not like to leave the little boy to give him the meeting. Oh no, as to leave the little boy, both father and mother were in much both father and mother were in much too strong and recent alarm to bear the thought, and Anne, in the joy of the escape, could not help adding her warm protestations to theirs. Charles Musgrove, indeed, afterwards showed more of inclination. Charles Musgrove, indeed, afterwards showed much more of inclination. The child was going on so well, and he wished so much to be introduced to Captain Wentworth that, perhaps, he might join them in the evening. He would not dine from home, but he might walk in for half an hour. But in this he was eagerly opposed by his wife with, "Oh no, indeed, Charles, I cannot bear to have you go away. Only think, if anything should happen." The child had a good night, and was going on well the next day. It must be a work of time to ascertain that no injury had been done to the spine, but Mr. Robinson found nothing to increase alarm, and Charles Musgrove began consequentially to feel no necessity for a longer confinement. The child was to be kept in bed, and amused as quietly as possible. But what was there for a father to do? This was a this was quite a female case, and it would be highly absurd in him, who could be of no more use at, who could be of no use at home, to shut himself up. His father very much wished him to meet Captain Wentworth, and there being no sufficient reason against it, he ought to go, and it ended in his making a bold public declaration, when he came in from shooting, of his meaning to dress directly and dine at the other house. Nothing can be going on better Nothing can be going on better than the child, said he. So I told my father just now that I would come, and he thought me quite right. Your sister being with you, my love, I have no scruple at all. You would not like to leave hi- you would not like to leave him yourself, but you see I can be of no use, and will send for me if anything is the matter. Husbands and wives generally understand when opposition will be in vain. Mary knew, from Charles' manner of speaking, that he was quite determined on going, and it would be of no use to tease him. She said nothing, therefore, till he was out of the room, but as soon as there was only Anne to hear, "So, you and I are to be left to shift by ourselves, and with this poor sick child, and not a creature coming near us all the evening. I knew how it would be. This is always my luck. If there is anything disagreeable going on, men are always sure to get out of it, and Charles is as bad as any of them. Very unfeeling. I must say it is very unfeeling of him to be running away from his poor little boy. Talks of his going talks of his being going on so well. How does he know that he is going on well, or that there may not be a sudden change half an hour hence? I did not think Charles would have been I did not think Charles would have been so unfeeling. So here he is to go away and enjoy himself, and because I am the poor mother, I am not to be allowed to stir. And yet I am sure I am more unfit than anybody else to be about the child. Me, my being the mother is the very reason why my feelings should not be tried. I am not at all equal to it. You saw how hysterical I was yesterday. But that was only the effect of the suddenness of your alarm, of the shock. You will not be hysterical again. I dare say we shall have nothing to distress us. I perfectly understand Mr. Robinson's discretions, and have no fears. And have no fears. And indeed, Mary, I cannot wonder at your husband. Nursing does not belong to a man; it is not his province. A sick child is always the mother's property. Her own feelings generally make it so. I hope I am as fond of my child as any mother, but I do not know that I am of any more use in the sick room than Charles, for I cannot always be scolding and teasing a poor child when it is ill, and you saw this morning that if I told him to keep quiet, he was sure to begin kicking about. I have not I have not nerves for the sort of thing. But could you be comfortable yourself to be spending the whole evening away from the poor boy? Yes, and you see his papa can, so why should not I? Jimina is so careful. If she could send us a word every hour how he was, I really think Charles might as well I really think Charles might as well have told his father we would all come. I am not more alarmed about little Charles now than he is. I was dreadfully alarmed yesterday, but today the case is very different today. Well, if you do not think it is too late to give yourself Well, if you do not think it is too late to give notice for your spell. Let's try that again. Well, if you do not think it is. Well, if you do not think it is too late to give notice for yourself, suppose you were to go, as well as your husband. Leave little Charles to my care. Mr. and Mrs. Musgrove cannot think it wrong while I remain with him. Are you serious? Cried Mary, her eyes brightening. Dear me, that's a very good thought. Very good indeed. To be sure, I may just as well go as not, for I am no use at home, am I? It only harasses me. You, who have not a mother's feelings, are a great deal the properest person. You can make little Charles do anything. He always minds you at a word. It'll be a great deal better than leaving him with only Jemima. Jemima? I actually didn't pay attention to how I said that the first time. It would be a great deal better than leaving him with only Jemima. Oh, I will certainly go. I am sure if I can, quite as much as Charles, for they want me excessively to be acquainted with Captain Wentworth, and I know you do not mind being left alone. An excellent thought of yours, indeed, Anne. I will go and tell Charles and get ready directly. You can send for us, you know, at a moment's notice if anything is the matter. But I dare say there will not but I dare say there will be nothing to alarm you. It should not go, you may be sure, if I did not feel quite at ease about my dear child. The next moment she was tapping at her husband's dressing room door, and as Anne followed her up the stairs, and as Anne followed and as Anne followed her upstairs, she was in time for the whole conversation, which began with Mary saying, in a tone of great exultation, I mean to go with you, Charles, for I am of no more use at the home than you are. If I were shut up myself forever with the child, I should not be able to persuade him to do anything he did not like. Anne will stay. Anne undertakes to stay at home and take care of him. It is Anne's own proposal, so I shall go with you, which will be a great deal better, for I have not dined at the other house since Tuesday. This is very kind of Anne, was her husband's answer, and I should be very glad to have you go. but it seems rather hard that she should be left alone. But it seems rather hard that she should be left at home by herself to nurse our sick child. Anne was now at hand to take up her own cause, and the sincerity of her manner being so sufficient to convince him, where, where conviction was at least very agreeable, he had no further scruples as to her being left he had no further scruples as to her being left alone. He had no further scruples as to her being left to dine alone, though he had still wanted her to join them in the evening, when the child might be at rest for the night, and kindly urged her to let him come and fetch her. But she was quite unpersuadable, and this being the case, she had ere long the pleasure of seeing them set off together in high spirits. They were gone, she hoped, to be happy, however oddly constructed such happiness might seem. As for as for herself, she was left with as many sensations of comfort as were perhaps ever likely to be hers. She knew herself to be of the first utility to the child, and what was it to her if Frederick Wentworth was only a half a mile distant, making himself agreeable to others? What is her tone there? She knew herself to be of the first utility to the child, and what was it to her if Frederick Wentworth were only a half a mile distant, making himself agreeable to others? She would have liked to know how he felt to She would have liked to know how he felt as to a meeting, perhaps indifference, if indifference could exist under such circumstances. Perhaps indifferent. That didn't feel right. Perhaps indifferent, if indifference could exist under such circumstances. He must be either indifferent or unwilling. Had he wished to, had he wished ever to see her again, he not he need not to have waited till this time. He would have done what she would have not but believed that in his place. He would have done what she could not but believe that in his place she should have done long ago. Okay. He would have done what she He would have done what she could not but believe that in his place she should have done long ago, when events had been early giving him the independence which alone had been wanting. Her brother and sister came back delighted with their new acquaintance and their visit in general. There had been music, singing, talking, laughing, all that was most agreeable, charming manners in Captain Wentworth, no shyness or reserve. They seemed all to know each other perfectly, and he was coming the very next morning to shoot with Charles. He was to come to breakfast, but not at the cottage, though that had been proposed at first, but then he had been pressed to come to the great house instead, and he seemed afraid of being in Mrs. Charles Musgrove's way on account of the child, and therefore somehow, they hardly knew how, it ended in Charles being to meet him to breakfast at his father's. Anne understood it. He wished to avoid seeing her. He had inquired after her, she found, slightly, as might suit a former slight acquaintance, seeming to acknowledge such as she had acknowledged, actuated perhaps by the same view of escaping introduction when they were to meet. The morning hours of the cottage were always later than those of the other house, and on the morrow the difference was so great that Mary and Anne were not more than beginning breakfast when Charles came in to say that they were just setting off, that he was come for his dogs, that his sisters were following with Captain Wentworth, his sisters meaning to visit Mary and the child, and Captain Wentworth proposing also to wait on, and Captain Wentworth and Captain Wentworth proposing also to wait on her for a few minutes, if not inconvenient. And though Charles had answered for the child's being in no such state as she could make it inconvenient, Captain Wentworth would not be satisfied without his running on to give his notice. Mary, very much gratified by this attention, was delighted to receive him, while a thousand feelings rushed on Nan, of which this was the most consoling, that it would soon be over. While a thousand feelings rushed on Nan, of which this was the most consoling, that it would soon be over. And it was soon over. In 2 minutes after Charles' preparation, the others appeared. They were in the drawing room. Her eye half met Captain Whitworth's. A bow, a curtsy passed. She heard his voice. He talked to Mary. Said all the... Hmm. Her eye half met Captain Whitworth's. A bow, a curtsy passed. She heard his voice. He talked to Mary. Said all that was right. Said something to the Miss Musgroves. Enough to mark an easy footing. The room seemed full of persons and voices, but a few minutes ended it. Charles showed himself at the window. All was ready. Their visitor had bowed and was gone. The Miss Musgroves were gone too, suddenly resolving to walk to the end of the village with the sportsmen. The room was cleared, and Anne might finish her breakfast as she could. It is over. It is over. She repeated to herself again and again. She repeated to herself again and again in nervous gratitude. The worst is over. Mary talked, but she could not attend. She had seen him. They had met. They had been once more in the same room. Soon, however, she began to reason with herself and try to be feeling less. 8 years, almost 8 years had passed since all had been given up. How absurd to be resuming the agitation which such an interval had banished into distance and indistinctness. Indistinctness. How absurd to be resuming the agitation which such an interval had banished into the distance and indistinctness. And what might not 8 years do? Events of every description, changes, alienations, removals, all must be comprised in it. In oblivion of the past, how natural, how certain too. All must be comprised in it. In oblivion of the past, how natural, how certain too. It included nearly a third part of her own life. Alas, with all her reasoning she found, then to retentive Alas, with all her reasonings she found. Alas, with all her reasonings she found that to retentive feelings 8 years may be a little more than nothing. Now, how were his sentiment? Now, how were his sentiments to be read? Was this like wishing to avoid her? And the next moment she was hating herself for the folly which asked the question. On the other question, which perhaps her utmost wisdom might not have prevented, she was soon spared all suspense, for after the Miss Musgroves had returned and finished their visit at the cottage, she had the spontaneous information from Mary. Captain Wentworth is not very gallant by you, Anne. Captain Wentworth is not very gallant by you, Anne, though he was so attentive to me. Henrietta asked him what he thought of you when they went away, and he said, you were so altered he should not have known you again. Mary had no feelings to make her respect her sisters in a common way, but she was perfectly unsuspicious of inflicting any peculiar wound. Altered beyond his knowledge, and fully submitted in silent, deep mortification. Doubtless it was so, and she could take no revenge, for he was not altered, or not for the worse. She had already acknowledged to herself, and she could not think differently, Let him think her, and she cannot think differently. Let him think of her as she, let him think of her as he would. No, the years which had destroyed her youth and bloom had only given a more no, the years which had destroyed her youth and bloom had only given him a more glowing, manly, open look, in no respect lessening his personal advantages. She had seen the same Frederick Wentworth, so altered that he should not have known her again. These were words which could not but dwell with her, yet she soon began to rejoice that she had heard them. They were of sobering tendency, they allayed agitation, they composed, and consequently must make her happier. Frederick Wentworth had used such words, or something like them, but without an idea that they would be carried round to her. He had thought her wretchedly altered, and in the first moment of appeal had spoken as he felt. He had not forgiven Anne Elliot. He had not forgiven Anne Elliot. She had used him ill, deserted and disappointed him, and worse, she had shown a feebleness of character in doing so, which his own decided, confident temper cannot endure. She had to give him up to oblige others. It had been the effect of over persuasion. It had been weakness and timidity. He had been most warmly attached to her, and had never seen a woman since whom he thought her equal. But except from some natural sensation of curiosity, he had no desire of meeting her again. Her power with him was gone forever. It was now his object to marry. He was rich, and being turned on shore, fully intended to settle as soon as he could properly fully intended to settle as soon as he could be. He was rich, and being turned on shore, fully intended to settle as soon as he could be properly tempted, actually looking round, ready to fall in love with all the speed of which a clear head ready to fall in love with all the speed which a clear head and quick taste could allow. He had a heart for either of the Miss Musgroves, if they could catch it. A heart, in short, for any pleasing young woman who came in his way, except Anne Elliot. This was his only secret exception, when he said to his sister, in answer to her suppositions, Yes, here I am, Sophia, quite ready to make a foolish match. Anybody between 15 and 30 may have me for asking. A little beauty, and a few smiles, and a few compliments to the navy, and I am a lost man. Should not this be enough for a sailor who has had no society among women to make him nice? He said it, she knew, to be contradicted. His bright, proud eyes spoke the happy conviction that he was nice, and Anne Elliot was not out of his thoughts when he more seriously described the woman he should wish to meet with. A strong mind, with sweetness of manner, made the first and last of the description. This is the woman I want, said he. Something a little inferior I shall of course put up with, but it must not be much. If I am a fool, I shall be a fool indeed, for I have thought on the subject more than most men. Alrighty, moving on to chapter 8. I think I just realized I didn't update the name of the live stream from chapters 4 through 6. Oh well. I can fix that in post. Chapter 8. From this time, Captain Wentworth and Anne Elliot were repeatedly in the same circle. They were soon dining in company together at Mr. Musgrove's, for the little boy's state could no longer supply his aunt with a pretence for absenting herself, and this was but the beginning of other dinings and other meetings. Whether former feelings were to be renewed, must be brought to the proof. Former times most undoubtedly be brought to the recollection of each. They could not but be reverted to. The year of their engagement could not but be named by him, and the little narratives or descriptions which conversations called forth. The profession qualified him, his suspicion led him to talk, and his profession qualified him, his disposition led him to talk, and that was in the year that was in the year 6. That happened before I went to the sea in the year 6. Occurred in the course of the first evening they spent together. And though his voice did not falter, and though she had no reason to suppose his eye wandering toward her while he spoke, Anne felt the utter impossibility, from her knowledge of his mind, that he could be unvisited by the remembrance any more than herself. There must be the same immediate association of thought, though she was very far from conceiving it to be of equal pain. They had no conversation together, no intercourse but what the commonest civility required. Once so much to each other, now nothing. There had been upon a time when all of the large party now filling the drawing room at upper there had been a time when all of the large party now filling the room at upper when all of the large party now filling the drawing room at Upper Cross, they would have been they would have found it most difficult to cease to speak to one another, with the exception perhaps of Admiral and Mrs. Croft, who seemed particularly attached and happy, and could allow no other exception among even among the married and could allow even no other exception even among the married couples. There could have been no two hearts so open, no tastes so similar, no feelings so in unison, no countenances so beloved. Now they were as strangers, nay, worse than strangers, for they could never become acquainted. It was perpetual estrangement. When he talked, she heard the same voice and discerned the same mind. There was a very general ignorance of all naval matters throughout the there was a general ignorance of all naval matters throughout the party, and he was very much questioned, and especially by the two Miss Musgroves, who seemed hardly to have any eyes but for him, as to the manner of living on the board. As to the manner of living on board, daily regulations, food, hours, and sea, and company, and etc. I don't have my phone near me. Probably and the rest. And the rest. And their surprise at his accounts, at learning the degree of accommodation and arrangement which was practicable, drew from him some pleasant ridicule, which reminded Anne of the early days when she too had been ignorant, and she too had been accused of supposing sailors to be living on board without anything to eat, or cook, or any cook to dress it if there were, or any servant to wait, or any knife and fork to use. I'm gonna try that again. Because that didn't come out very cleanly. I think I better have an idea of the flow of that paragraph now. When he talked, she heard the same voice and discerned the same mind. There was a very general ignorance of all naval matters throughout the party, and he was very much questioned, and especially by the two Miss Musgroves, who seemed hardly to have any eyes but for him, as to the manner of living on board, daily regulations, food, hours, etc., and their surprise at his accounts, at learning the degree of accommodation and arrangement which was practicable, drew from him some pleasant ridicule, which reminded Anne of the early days when she too had been ignorant, and she too had been accused of supposing sailors to be living on board without anything to eat, or any cook to dress it if there were, or any servant to wait, or any knife and fork to use. From thus listening and thinking, she was roused by a whisper of Mrs. Musgrove's, who, overcome by fond regrets, could not help saying, "Ah, Miss Anne, if it had pleased heaven to spare my poor son, I dare say he would have been just such another by this time." Anne suppressed a smile and listened kindly while Mrs. Musgrove relieved her heart a little more, and for a few minutes, therefore, could not keep pace with the conversation of the others. When she could let her attention take its natural course again, she found the Miss Musgroves just fetching the Navy List, their own Navy List, the first that had ever been at Uppercross, and sitting down together to pore over it, with the professed view of finding out the ships which Captain Wentworth had commanded. The Navy List. Uh, where are my footnotes? I'm at what, chapter 8? Navy List, the official register of naval officers and of current ships, issued annually. Okay. Your first was the Asp, I remember. We will look for the Asp. You will not find her there. Quite worn out and broken up. I was the last man who commanded her. Hardly fit for service then. Reported fit. There's spaces between those. You will not find her there. Quite worn out and broken up. I was the last man who commanded her. Hardly fit for service then. Reported fit for home service for a year or two. And so I was sent off to the West Indies. Are those supposed to mark breaks in conversation or just. I'm not sure how to read that. First off, what's the hit fit for home service? The Asp was unfit for long voyages, yet was dispatched to the West Indies. Wentworth's dry jokes here established his independent personality. You will not find her there. Quite worn out and broken up. I was the last man who commanded her. Hardly fit for service then. Reported fit for home service for a year or two. And so I was sent off to the West Indies. The girls looked on in amazement. The Admir, Admiralty? That just doesn't sound right. But I don't know how you pronounce it otherwise. The Admiralty, he continued, entertained themselves now and then with sending a few hundred men to sea in a ship not fit to be employed. But they have a great many to provide for, and among the thousands that may just as well go to the bottom as not, it is impossible for them to distinguish the very set who may be the least missed. Poof, poo, foof, foo or poo poo, poo poo. Phoo, phoo. That sounds like a F sound in my mind. Foo, foo. I have no clue. Foo, foo, cried the Admiral. What stuff these young fellows talk. Never was there a better sloop than the Asp in her day. For an old-built sloop, you would not see her equal. Lucky fellow to get her. He knows there must have been 20 better men than himself applying for her at the same time. Lucky fellow to get anything so soon, with no more interest than his. I feel my luck, Admiral, I assure you, replied Captain Wentworth seriously. Try that again. I felt my luck, Admiral, I assure you, replied Captain Wentworth seriously. I will as I was as well satisfied with my appointment as you can desire. It was a great object with me at that time to be at sea, a very great object. I wanted to be doing something. To be sure you did. What should a young fellow like you do ashore for half a year together? If a man has not a wife, he soon wants to be afloat again. But Captain Wentworth, cried Louisa, how vexed you must have been when you came to the Asp to see what an old thing they had given you. I knew pretty well what she was before that day, said he, smiling. I had no more discoveries to make than you would have to as than you would have as to than you would have as to the fashion and strength of any old police which you had seen lent among police. Actually, first off, what is that word? I got a footnotes. A long cloak or mantle reaching to the ankles. Huh. Okay. Uh, I'm definitely not going to be pronouncing that one correctly. Sorry. I had no more discoveries to make than you would have as to the fashion and strength of any old police which you had seen lent about among half your acquaintance, ever since you could remember. Okay, ever since you, which at last, let's not forget what day is unto yourself. Okay, gotcha. I have no more discoveries to make than you would have as to the fashion and strength of any old police which you had seen lent about half your acquaintance, ever since you could remember, and which at last, on some very wet day, is lent to yourself. Ah, she was a dear old asp to me. She did all that I wanted. I knew she would. I knew that we should I knew that we should either go to the bottom together, or that she would be the making of me, and I never had 2 days of foul weather all the time I was at sea at and I never had 2 days of foul weather all the time I was at sea in her. After taking privateers enough to be very entertaining, I had the good luck, in my passage home the next autumn, to fall in love, to fall in with the very French frigate I wanted. I brought her back into Plymouth, and here was another instance of luck. We had not been 6 hours in the Sound when a gale came upon, when a gale came on, which lasted 4 days and nights, and which would have done and which have and which would have done for poor old Asp in half the time, our touch with the great nation not having much improved in our touch with the great nation not having much improved our condition. Wow. Our touch with the great nation not having much improved our condition. 4 and 20 hours later, and I should only have been a gallant Captain Wentworth in a small paragraph at one corner of the newspapers, being lost only in a sloop. Nobody would have nobody would have thoughts about me. Couple of footnotes there. Interest, patronage. Privateers, privately owned ships of war commissioned by the state. They are mercenaries who receive booty from the captured enemy ships instead of wages. The practice only ended in 1856. I didn't realize that went along that long. So I thought the golden age of piracy was back in the 1700s. Sound straight. Great nation. Great nation was France. Oh, okay. I would not have guessed that. Our touch with the great nation not having much improved our condition. Anne's shudderings were to herself alone, but the Miss Musgroves could be as open as they were sincere, and their exclamations of pity and horror. And so then, I suppose, said Mrs. Musgrove, in a low voice, as if thinking aloud, so that he went away to the Laconia, and there he met with our own poor boy. And there he met with our poor boy, Charles, my dear, beckoning him to her. Do ask Captain Wentworth where it was he first met with your poor brother. I always forget. It was at Gibraltar, mother. I know. Oh, that's probably one of her daughters. It was at Gibraltar, mother. Gibraltar? Yeah. It was at Gibraltar, mother. I know. Dick had been left ill at Gibraltar, with a recommendation from his former captain to Captain Wentworth. Oh, but Charles, tell Captain Wentworth he need not be afraid of mentioning poor Dick before me, for it would be rather a pleasure to hear him talked of by such a good friend. Charles, being somewhat more mindful of the probabilities of the case, only nodded in reply and walked away. The girls were now hunting for the Laconia, and, and Captain Wentworth could not deny himself the pleasure of taking the precious volume into his own hands to save them the trouble, and once more read aloud the little statement of her name and rate and the present non-commissioned class, observing over it that she too had been one of the best friends man ever made. Ah, those were pleasant days when I had the Laconia. How fast I made money in her. A friend of mine and I had such a lovely cruise together off the Western Indies. Poor Harville, sister. You know how much he wanted money, worse than myself. He had a wife, excellent fellow. I shall never forget his happiness. He felt it all, so much for her sake. I wished for him again the next summer, when I had still the same luck in the Mediterranean. And I am sure, sir, said Mrs. Musgrove, it was a lucky day for us that when you were put captain into that ship. We shall never forget what you did. Her feelings made her speak low, and Captain Wentworth, hearing only in part, and probably not having Dick Musgrove at all near his thoughts, looked rather in surprise, and as if waiting for more. My brother, whispered one of the girls. Mamma is thinking of poor Richard. Poor dear fellow, continued Mrs. Musgrove. He was growing so steady, and such an excellent correspondent, while he was under your care. Ah, it would have been a happy thing if he had never left you. I assure you, Captain Wentworth, we are very sorry he ever left you. There was a momentary expression in Captain Wentworth's face at this speech, a certain glance of his bright eye and curl of his handsome mouth, which convinced Anne that instead of sharing in Mrs. Musgrove's kind wishes as to her son, he had probably been at some pains to get rid of him, but it was too transient an indulgence of self-amusement to be detected by any who understood him less than herself. In another moment, he was perfectly collected and serious, and almost instantly afterwards coming up to the sofa on which she and Mrs. Musgrove were sitting, took a place by the latter, and entered into conversation with her in a low voice about her son, doing it with so much sympathy and natural grace as showed the kindest consideration for all that was real and unobserved in her parents' feelings. As showed the kindest consideration for all that was real and unobserved in the parents' feelings. They were actually on the same sofa, for Mrs. Musgrove had most readily made room for him. They were divided only by Mrs. Musgrove. It was no insignificant barrier indeed. Mrs. Musgrove was of a more was Mrs. Musgrove was of a Oh wow. Not sure what happened with my camera there. Mrs. Musgrove was of a Mrs. Musgrove was of a with okay. Was of a Mrs. Musgrove was of a I have no clue where I was on the page. Mrs. Musgrove was of Mrs. Musgrove was a Mrs. Musgrove was of a comfortable Mrs. Musgrove was of a comfortable, substantial size. I should slow that sentence down. Mrs. Musgrove was of a comfortable, substantial size, infinitely more fitted by nature to express good cheer and good humor than tenderness and sentiment, and while the agitation of Anne's slender form and pensive face may be considered as very completely screened, Captain Wentworth would be allowed some credit for the self-command with which he attended to her large farce. Whew. I might not even get through 2 chapters before I hit an hour today. Captain Wentworth should be allowed some credit for the self-command with which he attended to her large... That was the word fat, okay. Large fat sighings over the destiny of a son whom a life nobody had cared for. They were actually on the same sofa, for Mrs. Musgrove had most readily made room for him. They were divided only by Mrs. Musgrove. It was no insignificant barrier indeed. Mrs. Musgrove was of a comfortable, substantial size, infinitely more fitted by nature to express good cheer and good humor than tenderness and sentiment. And while the agitation of Anne's slender form and pensive face, and while the agitation of Anne's slender form and pensive face may be considered as very completely screened, Captain Wentworth should not Captain Wentworth should be allowed some credit for the self-command with which he attended to her large fat sighings over the destiny. Captain Wentworth should be allowed some credit for the self-command with which he attended to her large fat sighings over the destiny of a son whom alive nobody had cared for. Please just start using periods. That don't get in a run-on sentence race with the Apostle Paul. No reader wins when you do that. Personal size and mental sorrow have certainly no necess- Personal size and mental sorrow had certainly no necessary proportions. A large bulky figure has good a large bulky figure has good a right to be in deep affliction as the most graceful set of limbs in the world. But, fair or not, there are unbecoming conjunctions which reason will patronize in vain, which taste cannot tolerate, which ridicule will seize. The Admiral, after taking 2 or 3 refreshing turns about the room with his hands behind him, being called to order by his wife, now came up to Captain Wentworth, and without any observation of what he might be interrupting, thinking only of his own thoughts, began with, "If you had been a week later at Lisbon last spring, Frederick, would you have been asked to give a passage to Lady Mary Grierson and her daughters?" Oh, that was not a question. "If you had been a week later at Lisbon last spring, Frederick, you would have been asked to give a passage to Lady Mary Grierson and her daughters." "Should I? I am glad I was not a week later then." The Admiral abused him for his want of gallantry. He defended himself, though professing that he would never willingly admit any ladies on board a ship of his, excepting for a ball or a visit which a few hours might comprehend. "But, if I know myself," said he, "this is from no want of gallantry towards them. It is rather from feeling how impossible it is, with all one's efforts and all one's sacrifices, to make the accommodation on board such as women ought to have. There could be no want of gallantry, Admiral, in rating the claims of every woman to every personal comfort high, and this is what I do. I hate to hear of women on board, or to see them on board, and no ship under my command shall ever convey a family of ladies anywhere if I can help it." This brought his sister upon him. "Oh, Frederick! But I cannot believe it of you. All idle refinement! Women may be as comfortable on board as in the best house in England. I believe I have lived in much on board as most women, and I know nothing superior to the accommodations of a man of war. I declare I have not a comfort or an indulgence about me, even at Kellynch Hall. I believe I have not a comfort or an indulgence about me, even at Kellynch Hall," with a kind bow to Anne, "beyond what I always had in most of the ships I have lived in, and what they have been five altogether." "Nothing to the purpose," replied her brother. "You were living with your husband. You were the only woman on board. But you yourself brought Mrs. Hart. But you yourself brought Mrs. Harville, her sister, her cousin, and the 3 children, Round from Portsmouth to Plymouth. Where was the superfine, extraordinary sort of gallantry of yours then? All merged in my friendship, Sophia. I would assist any brother's officer's wife that I could, and I would bring anything of Harville from the world's end if he wanted it. But do not imagine that I did not feel it an evil in itself. Depo- Depend upon it, they were all Hmm. I'm not sure who's talking. Depend upon it, they depend upon it that they were all perfectly comfortable. I might not like them. I might not like them. I might not like them the better for that, perhaps. Such a number of women and children have no right to be comfortable on board. My dear Frederick, you are you are talking quite idly. Pray, what will become of us poor sailors' wives, who often want to be conveyed to one port or another after our husbands, if everybody had your feelings? My feelings, you see, did not prevent my taking Mrs. Harville and all her family to Plymouth. But I hate to hear you talking so, like a fine gentleman, and as if women were all fine ladies, instead of rational creatures. We none of us expect to be in smooth water all our days. Ah, my dear, said the Admiral, when he has got a wife, he will sing a different tune. When he is married, if we have the good luck to live to another war, we shall see him do as you and I, and a great many others, have done. We shall have him very thankful to anybody that will bring him his wife. Ay, that we shall. Now I have done, cried Captain Wentworth. When once married people begin to attack me with, "Oh, you will think very differently when you are married," I can only say, "No, I shall not," and then they say again, "Yes, you will," and there is an end of it. He got up and moved away. What a great traveller you must have been, ma'am, said Mrs. Musgrove to Mrs. Croft. Pretty well, ma'am, in the 15 years of my marriage, though many women have done more. I have crossed the Atlantic 4 times, and have been once to the East Indies, and back again, and only once, besides being in different places about home, Cork, and Lisbon, and Gibraltar. But I never went beyond the Straits, and never was in the West Indies. We do not call Bermuda or Bahama, you know, the West Indies. Mrs. Musgrove had not a word to say in dissent. She could not accuse herself of ever having she could not accuse herself of having ever called them anything in the whole course of her life. And I do assure you, ma'am, pursued Mrs. Croft, that nothing can exceed the accommodations of a man of war. I speak, you know, of the higher rates. When you come to a frigate, of course, you are more confined, though though any reasonable woman may be perfectly happy in one of them, and I can safely say that the happiest part of my life was spent on board a ship. While we were together, you know, there was nothing to be feared. Thank God. I have always been blessed with excellent health, and no climate disagrees with me. A little disor- a little disordered always on the 24 hours of going to sea, but never knew what sickness was afterwards. The only time that I ever really suffered in body or mind, the only time that I ever fancied myself unwell, or had any ideas of danger, was the winter that I passed myself at Dale, when the Admiral, Captain Croft then, was in the North Seas. I lived perpetual fright at that time, and had all manner of imaginary complaints from not knowing what to do with myself, or when I should hear from him next. But as long as we could be together, nothing ever ailed me, and I never met with the smallest inconvenience. Ay, to be sure. Yes, indeed. Oh, yes. I am quite of your opinion, Mrs. Croft, was Mrs. Musgrove's hearty answer. There is nothing so bad as a separation. I am quite of your opinion. I know what it is, for Mr. Musgrove always attends the assizes, and I am so glad when they are over and he is safe back again. Assizes? I have no clue what that one was. A few days' absence from a home spent at the courts of the country town, Taunton, every few months. A very different matter from the Croft separation when he was at sea. She's doing her best to relate. The evening ended with dancing. Honest being proposed and offered her services as usual, and though her eyes would sometimes fill with tears as she sat at the instrument, she was extremely glad to be employed, and desired nothing in return but to be unobserved. It was a merry, joyous party, and no one seemed in a higher spirits than Captain Wentworth. She felt that he had done everything to elevate him. She felt they had done everything to elevate him, which general attention and deference, and especially the attention of all the young ladies, could do. The Miss Hayters, the females of the family of cousins already mentioned, were apparently admitted to the honor of being in love with him, and as for Henrietta and Louisa, they both seemed so entirely occupied by him that nothing but the continued appearance of the most perfect goodwill between themselves could have made it credible that they were not decided rivals. And as for Henrietta and Louisa, they were they both seemed so entirely occupied by him that nothing but the continued appearance of the most perfect goodwill between them could have made it credible that they were not decided rivals. If he were a little spoiled by such universal, such eager admiration, who could wonder? These were some of the thoughts which occupied Anne, while her fingers were mechanically at work, proceeding for half an hour together, equally without error, and without consciousness. Once she felt that he was looking at herself, observing her altered features perhaps, trying to trace in them the ruins of the face which had once charmed him, and once she knew that he must have spoken of her. She was hardly aware of it till she heard the answer, but then she was sure of his having asked his partner whether Miss Elliot never danced. The answer was, "Oh, no, never. She has quite given up on dancing. She had rather play. She is never tired of playing." Once, too, he spoke to her. She had left the instrument on the dancing being over, and he had sat down to try to make out an air which he wished to give the Miss Musgroves an idea of. Unintentionally, she had returned to that part of the room. He saw her, and instantly rising, said with studied politeness, "I beg your pardon, madam. This is your seat." And though she immediately drew back with a decided negative, he was not to be induced to sit down again. Anne did not Anne did not wish for more of such looks and speeches. His cold politeness, his ceremonious grace, were worse than anything. Okay. Um, it's been an hour. I might just wrap it up there for tonight and pick up on chapter 9 next time. Okay. Anyone that stopped by to watch this, thank you. Hope you enjoyed it. Appreciate the support.